Act 1. The Weaver of Capernaum. The sun was dipping below the rugged hills of Lower Galilee, casting a bruised purple and amber glow over the waters of the lake. In the bustling fishing village of Capernaum, the evening air smelled of salt, drying nets, and roasting fish. But inside a small, mud-brick house away from the shore, the air felt heavy and stagnant. Here lived Joel, a weaver in his late 30s. Joel's hands, which once flew across the loom with rhythmic grace, now moved slowly, his fingers stiff and trembling. For months, a creeping paralysis had been stealing the strength from his limbs. Worse than the physical ailment was the darkness that had settled in his heart. A year prior, a sudden, violent storm on the Sea of Galilee had taken his younger brother, a fisherman. Since then, Joel had looked at the lake not as a source of life, but as a graveyard. Sitting at his loom in the fading light, Joel dropped his shuttle. It clattered against the dirt floor. He sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Still working in the dark, my love." It was his wife, Leah. She entered carrying a small clay lamp, its tiny flame flickering bravely against the encroaching night. She knelt, picked up the shuttle, and placed it back in his trembling palm, her eyes full of a fierce, protective tenderness. "The fabric won't finish itself, Leah," Joel said, his voice bitter. "The tax collector doesn't care if my hands refuse to obey me. He only cares about the silver." "The market can wait," Leah said softly, smoothing his matted hair. "Have you heard the rumors in the square today? The healer from Nazareth, they say he has returned to the Galilee region. They say he is staying near the shore." Joel scoffed, turning his face away. "Nazareth is a town of dust and stone. What good ever came from there? People are desperate, Leah. They see miracles in every shadow because they cannot bear the weight of reality. A star could fall from heaven, and they would claim it was a sign for them." Leah didn't argue. Instead, she walked to the small window and looked out toward the lake. The first stars were beginning to pierce the twilight canopy. "Look," she murmured. Joel reluctantly shifted his gaze. High above the hills of Galilee, uniquely bright and pulsing with a strange, cool silver light, was a star he hadn't noticed before. It didn't twinkle like the others. It glowed with a steady, intentional brilliance, casting a long, faint ribbon of light across the dark, glass-like surface of the sea. "They say that star appeared when he crossed into the region," Leah whispered. "They call it the Star Over Galilee." "It's just a star, Leah," Joel muttered, though in truth, a strange, forgotten warmth stirred faintly in his chest. Act 2. The Call of the Sea. The next morning, the village was loud with excitement. Word had spread that the teacher, Jesus, was preaching on the plain near the water. Leah tried to persuade Joel to go, but his pride and fear held him back. "I am a weaver, not a beggar," he insisted. "I will not go clawing through a crowd for magic tricks." By afternoon, however, Joel's condition worsened. A sudden spasm seized his legs, and he fell heavily against the loom, snapping a primary warp thread. The work of 3 weeks, ruined in a second. Despair, sharp and suffocating, washed over him. He needed to get out. He needed to escape the suffocating walls of his failure. Using a sturdy wooden staff, Joel dragged himself out of the house. He didn't want to go to the crowd, so he headed in the opposite direction, toward the desolate, rocky cliffs overlooking the northern shore of the lake. The climb was agonizing. Every step felt as though his veins were filled with lead. By the time he reached a high ledge, the sun was setting again, and the fierce Galilean winds were picking up. The water below, peaceful hours ago, was now tossing violently, churning with white foam. Joel collapsed onto a boulder, gasping for breath. He looked down at the angry sea. "This is where it happened," he thought. "This is where the water swallowed my brother." As the darkness deepened, the tempest grew. The wind howled through the ravines, threatening to blow Joel right off his perch. He felt utterly alone, stranded between a broken life and a merciless nature. Then he looked up. Through the heavy, tearing storm clouds, the strange star broke through. It was impossibly bright, cutting through the gloom like a lighthouse. The light did not banish the storm, but it illuminated the path down the cliffside, casting a brilliant silver beam directly toward a small cove below. And then, through the roaring wind, Joel heard a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was singing, or rather a resonant, calm voice speaking. Intrigued, and driven by a sudden, inexplicable compulsion, Joel began the treacherous descent toward the illuminated cove, his staff slipping on the wet rocks. Act 3. The Encounter in the Storm. When Joel finally reached the pebbled shore of the cove, the wind suddenly dropped, as if the surrounding cliffs were shielding the small beach from the worst of the gale. There, standing near the water's edge, was a small group of men. They were pulling a heavy wooden fishing boat onto the shore, battling the heavy surf. Among them stood a man who did not look like the others. He wore a simple, travel-stained tunic, but he carried himself with an effortless authority. As Joel watched from the shadows of the rocks, the man turned. His eyes locked directly onto Joel. Joel froze. He wanted to turn and hide his crippled frame, but his legs wouldn't move, not from paralysis, but from awe. The man walked away from the boat, stepping over the wet stones until he stood just a few paces from the weaver. "You have come a long way up the mountain just to seek the depths, Joel," the man said. His voice was calm, yet it carried over the sound of the crashing waves. Joel's breath caught. "How do you know my name?" The man smiled gently, the starlight reflecting beautifully in his eyes. "I know the weaver, who knits his grief into every garment. I know the brother who looks at the sea and sees only a thief." Tears, hot and angry, spilled over Joel's cheeks. "If you know so much, then you know the sea is a thief. It took my brother. It took my livelihood. And now, my own body is betraying me. If your star is a sign of hope, it has brought its light to the wrong man. I am empty." Jesus stepped closer, placing a warm, heavy hand on Joel's trembling shoulder. The moment that hand touched him, Joel felt a sensation like liquid lightning rushing through his veins. It wasn't painful, it was a profound, revitalizing heat. "The star does not shine because the world is bright, Joel," Jesus said softly. "It shines because the night is dark. Your brother is not lost to the one who numbers the hairs on your head. And your hands still have much work to do." Act 4. The Awakening. "Stand up straight, Joel. Drop the staff," Jesus commanded gently. "I cannot," Joel wept. "If I let go, I fall. Trust the light that brought you here." With a trembling breath, Joel looked up at the great Star over Galilee, then down at his white-knuckled grip on the wooden staff. Slowly, finger by finger, he unclasped his hand. The staff clattered into the wet pebbles. Joel waited for the familiar collapse, the sudden drop into the dirt. But it didn't come. His ankles felt solid. His knees, which had buckled for months, held firm. He straightened his spine, standing to his full height for the first time in over a year. He raised his hands before his face. The tremors were gone. His fingers moved fluidly, strong and capable. He gasped, laughing and crying simultaneously. He fell to his knees, not out of weakness, but out of absolute reverence, pressing his forehead against the cool, wet earth. "Thank you, teacher," he sobbed. When Joel looked up a moment later to touch the hem of the man's garment, the cove was quiet. Jesus and his disciples had already boarded the boat, pushing out into the deep waters, moving toward the next village that required healing. But as the boat drifted into the misty darkness, the silver beam of the star followed them, lighting their way across the water. Act V. The Weaver's New Thread. The walk back to Capernaum did not take hours. Joel practically ran. He didn't need the staff. His feet felt light, as if he were walking on air. He burst through the door of his home just as the dawn was beginning to break, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Leah was sitting by the broken loom, her face buried in her hands, weeping for fear that her husband had perished in the nighttime storm. "Leah!" Joel cried out. She jumped up, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at him, standing upright, his chest heaving, his face radiant, completely devoid of the crutches that had bound him. "Joel? What happened?" she stammered, rushing to him. Joel caught her in his arms, lifting her slightly and spinning her around with a strength he hadn't possessed in years. "The rumors were true, Leah. More than true. I met him by the shore. He knew my grief, he knew my name, and he gave me back my life. He led her over to the broken loom. With steady, precise movements, Joel took up a new, vibrant blue thread, the color of the Galilean sky on a perfectly clear day. With a joyful rhythm, his hands began to weave once more, the shuttle flying smoothly between the threads. From now on, Joel said, looking out the window where the morning sun was finally eclipsing the great star, I will not weave garments of mourning. I will weave the story of the light. Because even when the fiercest storms shake the Galilee, the star still shines for those who look up. And from that day forward, the weaver of Capernaum became a living testament. Every piece of cloth that left his shop carried a small, uniquely woven silver star in the corner, a reminder to all who saw it that darkness could never conquer the light that had come to heal the world.